When he's not busy serving as chief White House correspondent for NEWSMAX, my next guest is also an accomplished author. Tonight he's here to talk about his brand new book on one of the most influential legal minds in U.S. history, Antonin Scalia. Scalia, Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986, captures the first 50 years of Justice Antonin Scalia's life. Please welcome back to the program, James Rosen. James, great to see you. Now, I know you meticulously researched this biography. What inspired you, what drew you to dedicate 5 years of your life to write about Nino Scalia?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me back, Raymond. It's an honor to be back with you.
A pleasure.
This book has its origins in my high school years in the 1980s when I first saw Justice Scalia on television on a program called The Constitution, That Delicate Balance on PBS, where eminent minds were situated in a theater in the round setting and debated hypotheticals. He struck me as so different from the other participants, who included other Supreme Court justices, the likes of Dan Rather, Gerald Ford, and what have you. And when I first got to Washington as a reporter in 1999, then for Fox News, one of the first things I did was write to Justice Scalia seeking an interview. And that commenced an extraordinary correspondence between us that went on for a couple of years, amusing and unusual, and I'll be covering that in volume 2 of this biography. And we also had a pair of lunches, one-on-one, at the AV Ristorante, his favorite Italian restaurant, where we drank wine together. He made me eat off of his plate. I was like, Mr. Justice, I can't. He said, come on, come on, come on. So there I am shoveling vegetables off of Justice Scalia's plate. He drove me back to my office in his car, and I've subsequently confirmed with classmates who knew him back in the 1950s, as well as clerks in the 21st century, that it was a scary experience for them as well as for me. And so I knew from those extraordinary experiences with him about a quarter century ago, when he was very, very generous to a young reporter, that someday I would write about him.
James, as you mentioned, you knew Justice Scalia. Tell me a little bit about the man that you encountered, and was he aware that you planned to write a biography of him?
I didn't even plan necessarily to write a biography of him at that point. I was really just reaching out for an interview. The lunches were held off the record. They will remain that way. However, in terms of the substance of the conversations, I will be excerpting from our amusing and unusual correspondence in Volume 2, which occurred on Supreme Court stationery. He was very down to earth, I found, in my exposure to him of over maybe 3.5 hours time with him. You could be forgiven, seated across a table at the AV Ristorante from him, for periodically forgetting that you're in the presence of one of the most brilliant intellectual minds of our time, and just imagining that you're having lunch with your avuncular Italian uncle, a sort of Paul Sorvino-like character. He was that down to earth. But I'll tell you one interesting story about that, which again doesn't really touch on the substance of our conversations, where I arrived first at the AV Ristorante. This will be in Volume 2. Right now, the book Scalia, Rise to Greatness tells the story of his rise to the Supreme Court, his taking his seat on the Supreme Court. And Volume 2 will cover his Supreme Court tenure. I arrived first for lunch. And when he arrived, he was a sort of silhouetted, jaunty figure with the sunshine from outside shining in through the front door and making him appear silhouetted as he sort of strolled towards me. Pleasantries were effectuated, and he then grabs the menu and asks of our waiter, who was a young fellow who was really Italian and spoke only broken English, "What is pulpy? What is pulpy?" And the waiter says, "Octopus." And he says, "Octopus, I'll have the pulpy." And he hands the menu. And I decided to go for something easily manipulable with a knife and fork, veal parmesan, reflecting my own Staten Island heritage. And the guy's writing it down, and Justice Scalia says, "No, no, no." And he says to the waiter, "Give him the rabbit." And the waiter and I look at him in unison and say, "Rabbit?" And he says, yeah, you're gonna like the rabbit. Give him the rabbit." And the waiter stalked off and eventually returned with rabbit. Raymond, I hadn't had rabbit ever in my life until that moment. I don't think I've had it since. We're going back 25 years. And it was an example of the country's foremost opponent of judicial activism overruling my lunch order. Maybe
that's classic Nino. He always knew better in life, if not in the law. I want to get into Scalia's upbringing. He was born in New Jersey, grew up in Queens. His father was a Sicilian immigrant, and his mother, the daughter of Italian immigrants. He was Jesuit educated. How did that particular setting at that time in history form Nino Scalia to be the man and the jurist he would later become?
So this book, Scalia, Rise to Greatness, First of all, it's the first admiring biography of Antonin Scalia, which means it's the first accurate biography of Antonin Scalia. The two previous biographies were, one of which he cooperated with extensively, both turned out fairly contemptuous of the justice's philosophy, his jurisprudence, his legacy, his conduct. So this is the first admiring portrait of him at book length, and it draws on a wealth of documentary and personal sources that were unavailable to or overlooked by the previous biographers. Among these documents is a secret oral history of his life that Justice Scalia conducted in his Supreme Court chambers in 1992, and which was only recently unsealed, and I'm the first biographer to make use of it. He was asked in that secret oral history in 1992 if he believed that his Jesuitical training, he was the valedictorian both at his Jesuit high school, Xavier High School in Manhattan, which is a rare hybrid of a Jesuit institution and a military academy. He was valedictorian there, and then went to Georgetown University, another Jesuit institution where, again, he was valedictorian. He was asked in that oral history by his interviewer, an attorney he had known for many years, whether he believed his Jesuitical training came to affect his view of originalism and original meaning as the defining goal for judges and justices on the Supreme Court, with its reverence for text and what have you. And Justice Scalia was reluctant to draw that connection, but there's no question that his Catholic faith, his parents were devout Catholics, and his training at the hands of the Jesuits instilled in him a reverence for text and also a kind of rigor and polish to the rhetorical enterprise. And I tell the story, I interviewed one of his few surviving classmates from Xavier, a man who became an Opus Dei priest, Father Connor, who's one of the most important interviewees in the whole book, and who is still preaching and blogging actively in his 80s, very sharp of memory and logic, about Scalia's early faith. And he was a witness to Scalia's faith as a foundational propellant for him, if you will. So this is the first biography that really treats Scalia's faith in the depth that it deserves. One point, Scalia resisted all attempts to suggest that he imbued his decisions with his Catholic faith. He used to say, there's no such thing as a Catholic hamburger. The closest we could come would be a hamburger that's perfectly made.
Classic Scalia. You write about his father, Sam, this way: a good man, moral character was king in Sam's eyes, prized more than intellect or wealth. Son, he would tell Nino, brains are like muscles. You can rent them by the hour. The only thing that's not for sale is character. Above all, Salvatore's life and work represented the essence, the full power of the American dream, and the younger Scalia internalized this early on. Indeed, it later informed the justice's jurisprudence. Tell us about the influence of Sam Scalia and how that, if not the Catholicism, may have shaped his jurisprudence. And what of his mother, Catherine?
So Justice Scalia's father and his mother both died just around the same time as each other, and just before Antonin Scalia was nominated to the Supreme Court. So they lived to see him become an appellate court judge. And that was the one bittersweet element of his confirmation to the Supreme Court for him. And we have the previously unpublished story here of a law clerk who was working with him at that time that happened, where he finally secured a seat on the Supreme Court. And the clerk mentioned, it's too bad your parents didn't live to see it. And Scalia actually weeps in memory of his parents. They were both teachers. The father came here not knowing English in 1920 and became a renowned Romance languages professor. His mother, as you say, was a school teacher. Between their teaching profession, their dedication to classic texts, and Salvatore Scalia's particular suspicion of the damage that could be done in unfaithful translation of texts from one language to another, and with the immersion in the Catholic faith, where foundational texts are central to the entire denomination and to the entire religion. Scalia emerged with an extraordinary reverence for text, whether it was the text of Shakespeare or whether it was the text of liturgy, and this informed his jurisprudence.
You write at length about Nino's larger-than-life personality. Justice Scalia, at the beginning of the book, you have this little interview with his daughter, Meg, which I loved. And Meg says after his death, when people described him as larger than life, he was. And he was that way to us. And you say, and he was cognizant that he was that way, right? And Meg says, oh, yes, oh, yeah. I mean, he was putting on a show, but it was a great show. And you asked, where did that persona come from? Did it come from his college debating or his acting experience? Was it there all along? Tell us about what you discovered about his educational development and how that shaped this larger-than-life personality that we've, of course, came to know and some of us to love.
Well, another Catholic priest who was interviewed for this project was Father Paul Scalia, Justice Scalia's son. And he reminded me of how his father used to regale him with stories, again, when he was attending Xavier High School, a Jesuit military academy in the 1950s, and from which Scalia graduated as valedictorian, that he and his classmates, including the future Father Bob Connor, were terrorized by a particular Jesuit priest who would have them conjugate Latin verbs in 60 seconds time under the threat of an actual ticking stopwatch. And he and Father Bob, to the end of their days together, when they remained friends, whenever they got together at the Scalia's house in Northern Virginia, the first thing they would do is conjugate Latin verbs for 60 seconds, seeing who would do it better. But that commitment to rigor is what Father Scalia told me about his father's development and education, that we can see in his opinions, because his liveliness as a writer, which was central to his influence and very much deliberate by him, is also informed by a strict grammatical sense. He was a snoot, by his own admission, which is a word that means someone who cares maybe a little too much about words and usage, and gets strict with other folks about it. And so all of this really did come, in a sense, from his father's work, his mother's work as a teacher, but also the Catholic faith and the Jesuits.
Yeah, and you know, I met Nino, James, just as a sidebar here. He used to go to Old St. Mary's, which had the Latin Rite, the old Latin Mass. And he was there faithfully every morning, reading his missal. But it was that same sense of tradition, the rigor, as you say, of language and liturgy that I think bled over into his everyday life and his view of the world. You write about a significant event in the lives of Antonin and Maureen Scalia in 1960, his wife, that's quite telling. They attended a performance of A Man for All Seasons, the story of St. Thomas More. You write, the tale of unshakable Catholic faith and fidelity to the rule of law deeply touched the Scalias. After her husband's death, Maureen recalled that the play grew in significance to us over the years. Scalia regularly quoted it, closing out law courses with a reading of his favorite passage. Why do you think that play and Moore's example touched Nino so deeply?
So first of all, we've just now mentioned Maureen Scalia. This book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, presents the most intimate portrait of the relationship between Antonin Scalia and Maureen Scalia, and the most comprehensive. And Maureen Scalia is a hero of this book, or a heroine in her own right. And as Gene Scalia said to me, he is the oldest son of Justice Scalia, a prominent attorney in his own right and formerly a cabinet official in the Trump administration. He said, "You're writing a book about my dad." He said, "I could probably name other important or influential Supreme Court justices." In effect, Gene told me, "I can't tell you anyone else who accomplished what my mom did." Maureen Scalia raised the 9 Scalia children without very much assistance from Antonin Scalia, as he was the first to say. And this book explores really the sacrifices of Maureen Scalia to that effect. And so the Scalias' reverence for this play throughout their lives, after seeing it as newlyweds in Europe in the early 60s, revolves around their view that their devotion to God should be their first priority over any other consideration, including considerations of state or promotion or even imminent death. And
in addition to that, he always carried that faith with him. It was very important to him. I can remember him hissing at people who dared to talk after Mass, James. He loathed that. You know, little people would be whispering to each other, "Oh, it's great to see you." "Shh, quiet. And it was like, okay, Scalia spoke and everybody clear out. He loathed judicial activism when a judge imposed their personal politics on a case rather than applying only what is written in the text of the Constitution or the law at hand. How did he arrive at originalism as the best way of interpreting law? Where did that come from?
So the readers of Scalia Rise to Greatness will chart the development of this originalism and textualism approach to the interpretation of the Constitution and statutory laws that was spawned in Scalia and which basically was the centerpiece of his extraordinary legacy, his impact on the law and American society. In his answers to questions about when his originalism first formed, Scalia himself was kind of all over the lot, I saw, in reviewing all of his published interviews over the years. At times he suggested that he had always had this view. At other times he suggested that it came to him sometime around Watergate when he would have been 40 years of age. Having interviewed colleagues of his in the Ford-era Department of Justice, where he was Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel, responsible for developing legal opinions that are binding to say whether any particular action by the Ford administration would be lawful or unlawful. His deputies told me, who are still around today and teaching law, that he didn't impress upon them that in their court filings at the time, in the mid-1970s, they should take any particular originalist approach. So he wasn't famous, he wasn't exhibiting at that point what he later became famous for. But all in all, as we've been discussing, Raymond, I think his approach to originalism, the idea that the law shouldn't be considered like a living constitution that can expand to take account of new phenomena like nuclear weapons or the internet. The law should be applied and interpreted according to its original meaning, the meaning it was widely understood to have at the time it was enacted, and not loaded up like a Christmas tree, if you will, with latter-day policy preferences. And the best tool, Scalia said, for determining the original meaning of a law is not the legislative history that preceded it, where people spoke on the Senate floor or injected things into committee reports. Scalia said the best way to discern the original meaning of the Constitution or any other statute passed since then is the text of that law. And by the time he died, no less a figure than Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, an appointee of Barack Obama, proclaimed that thanks to Scalia's influence, often sometimes exercised in solo dissent, not always as a part of the winning side in any Supreme Court cases, thanks to his revolution, so to speak, quote, "We are all originalists now."
You break new ground in the book, James, regarding Antonin Scalia's own thoughts about his future. It was widely believed and often said that he had no goal or calling to the High Court. You uncovered a conversation he had with a friend back in 1959 that indicates otherwise. What is that? Right.
So we mentioned earlier Father Bob Connor, who knew Scalia just as Bob Connor back in their Xavier days in high school. They were in the marching band together. They played basketball together. Scalia set Bob Connor up with a girl at that time, according to Father Connor's recollections. They drift a little bit, but remained friends through college. And this is something that Father Connor has never confided to anyone before, and he is an unimpeachable source on the matter. I asked him if he'd ever been interviewed by anybody ever before about his relationship with Justice Scalia, and he said no. And I said, what about the FBI? Because the FBI conducted background checks on Scalia 4 times in 14 years, and sometimes went all the way back to people who knew him when he was 13. And the Father Connor said, no, not by the FBI either. I think I'd remember that. And what he told me was that in the summer of 1959, when Connor decided to drop out of medical school and pursue the study of Opus Dei in Rome, Bob Connor's parents were distraught that they thought their son was throwing away his future, so his mother summoned 2 people who she thought might be able to talk sense into her wayward son, Bob Connor. One was a Jesuit priest who did come by the house. The other was young Nino Scalia, then 22 years old, and in law school. And Father Connor told me this scene. He remembered it vividly, the address on Downey Road in Queens, on the south side of the street, where he was up on the 2nd floor in his brother's bedroom. And out of nowhere, in walks into his brother's bedroom Nino Scalia, whom he hadn't seen in a few years. And Scalia says to him, "What are you doing?" And Bob Connor, Father Connor recounted this to me, said, "I'm going to go study Opus Dei." I asked if, as devout as he was, Scalia seemed to evince any understanding of what Opus Dei was. Connor told me that he explained it to him, that it's the study of the sanctity, of the finding of sanctity in everyday life. And Scalia sort of nodded and shook his head thoughtfully. And then, according to Father Connor, and again, this story has never appeared in print before, this book, Father Connor said, "What are you doing?" And Scalia replied, "I'm going to the Supreme Court." And Father Connor said, "How are you going to do that?" And at this point in the interview, he said to me, "James, he had a job lined up with some law firm in Ohio." I said, "Jones Day." He said, "Yes, it was Jones Day," which was based then in Cleveland, but had then, as it does now, a Washington office. And Scalia said, when Father Bob said, or Bob Connor said, "How are you going to do that?" Scalia said, mentioned the job with the law firm he had coming up, which indeed Scalia took, and said, "They have a Washington office. I will be sent to Washington, and I will rise." I asked Father Connor, did that strike you as farcical, that he would say such a thing? "I'm going to the Supreme Court and I will rise to the Supreme Court"? He said, "Not at all. Nino was driven." I asked, did you get the idea that he considered it a divine calling? He said, "I bet." And the way Father Connor described it to me was a transcendental convergence, almost epiphanal in nature, between the two young men, in which one said, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm going to Opus Dei." And he said back to him, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm going to the Supreme Court." This answers and resolves a mystery that had attended the literature in Scalia's life of when he really first began to harbor the ambition to become a Supreme Court justice. His ardent defenders, which include his family, his clerks, and others, have always been leery of attributing this ambition to Scalia too soon, because they did not want to contribute to a false careerist narrative of his life that the previous biographies had promulgated. My view is the conversation with Father Connor is decisive on the point. No one, including the Scalia family, should be upset about this, because there are certain individuals who know early on their destiny. Charles Schulz, the creator of Peanuts, Charlie Brown and Snoopy, said he wanted to be a cartoonist from the age of 5. Antonin Scalia, from a very young age, knew what the Supreme Court was and why he belonged there, and he pursued it within propriety. It was not through careerist sort of currying of favor with more powerful men by tailoring his opinions this way or that. Frequently he did the opposite, and he rendered unpopular opinions. But it was kind of a manifest destiny, and that's why I consider Father Connor one of the most important interviewees in the entire book.
James, we could go on much longer, but the book is really amazing. I mean, not only have you captured, I think, the man and his eloquence, but you've done it eloquently. Scalia, Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986, by James Rosen, is available now at bookstores everywhere and online, and you can follow James on Twitter at James Rosen TV. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raymond.